Hey y'all, welcome to Geek Freaks. I am Frank, and today we are joined by Cy and Gordon. How are you guys doing today?
Doing well.
Good, good. Cy and Gordon wrote Leaders Assemble, Leadership in the MCU, a new book that's coming out today, guys, so make sure you pick this up. Can one of you guys explain what this book is about?
So the book is about talking about leadership theory and leadership using examples from the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Both Gordon and I are professors, and we teach leadership. And one of the big challenges is kind of communicating what leadership is and kind of drawing in students' attention about leadership and leadership theory. And the Marvel Cinematic Universe has a lot of great examples of leadership.
Okay. Is there something that you guys saw like missing in the leadership education field that you thought, you know what, let's use MCU to kind of fill in this gap? Gordon, do you have anything to speak to that?
Yeah. So, I think a lot of times in leadership education too, we talk about big theories of leadership. So something like transformational leadership, people like Gandhi getting people to act on, we're going to put our lives on the line and work towards this freedom or these big tasks. And that's great. But a lot of us in day to day, that's not what we're doing. And so it's one of the things where I feel like sometimes students will be like, yeah, leadership's cool. And then they go back to, just normal life. And they're like, how do I do this? What, like, I'm not Gandhi, right?
Right. Yeah.
And so that's one of the things I think the Marvel movies do is they're very connected to these characters. And they've got, pros and cons. They make mistakes. And they're heroes. So when we talk about somebody like Gandhi, we talk about him as if he's perfect, right? Well, when we talk about Tony Stark, nobody thinks Tony Stark is perfect in the comics or in the movies, right? And that's a lot closer to the way we are, right? We all have our strengths, our weaknesses, our blind spots, different opinions. And so to me, the Marvel characters make this stuff more real, which feels weird when we're talking about Gandhi's a real person and Tony Stark, spoilers, is a fictional character, right? But there's these characters we really care about and understand, and we see them on multiple sides. And so to me, kind of the book fills a hole a little bit in making sure we really connect with people and their experience and these things they care about. Because, we talk about CEOs, we talk about famous generals, but that's not really our day-to-day life. And so the book, I would say in some of the chapters, we really do sort of, here's an example from this movie that you like, here's the theory and what it's about and explaining it in easy ways. And then we also have people reflect and think about their own experiences and how they might do it. So the end of every chapter talks about, okay, we talked about servant leadership with Captain America. How could you use this as a person? And we have a whole chapter at the end that tries to get that even more. And our perspective on leadership is this idea of leadership as a process. So it's not just if you're called the boss, you're in charge and everybody listens. Because, Frank, that ain't true.
Yeah. Amen. Yeah.
You don't listen to our bosses all the time unless they successfully influence us, unless we buy in. We don't have to. We can do our jobs pretty poorly and still not get fired, right?
Yeah.
And so we talk a lot about we all are leaders. We all engage in leadership. And so you're learning those skills and those perspectives that help you to have more influence. Because, a lot of times the most influential person in your work group or in your social group is not somebody that's got a hat that says I'm the leader, right? It's somebody who we respect, somebody who has good ideas, someone who we can trust, not somebody who's the boss. And I think with the Avengers in particular and groups like that, they're just individuals, right? That do their own thing. They can save the world on their own. They don't see, I need somebody to tell me what to do, right?
Yeah.
And so they really need to influence how they need to convince each other. They can't just be, well, we all listen to Tony because he's got the money, because they don't.
Yeah. Where do you see leadership being valuable in just the everyday life of somebody who's walking down the streets, maybe not doesn't have the boss title, but would like to benefit from this book?
So I think the way that the average person can kind of benefit from the book is sort of how Gordon was talking about. You can influence people in positive ways within the workplace.
Yeah.
So even if you're not looking to lead an entire team, you may have an idea that you want implemented. And if you want that idea implemented, you need to work on influencing. And that's why we focus in the book on relationships, how people leverage those relationships, and how you can kind of accomplish things that you want. Because a lot of times people may not want to have the title of being a leader. They may not want to be a manager, but you still want things to be effective within your work team. You want things to kind of function the way that you want within your work life. And so it's a good way to kind of think about, well, if I want to make a change here, maybe I can read a little bit about transformational leadership theory. And I remember I watched Tony Stark try to change the following things. Maybe I can do some of that in my own life. And so there's a lot of different ways of thinking about leadership. A lot of times we get caught up in this idea that you have to have a title in order to lead. But as Gordon was talking about this, I started to think about maybe my favorite X-Men character growing up was Wolverine, who many characters listened to, and he had a lot of influence. So, for example, he is a common mentor for characters like Kitty Pryde, but he's never really given the leader title, right? It's always Cyclops, it's always Storm. It's occasionally Magneto joins the X-Men and decides like, hey, I'm gonna be headmaster for a little bit.
The real fun episodes or issues, yeah.
Yeah. And Gordon, I think you wanted to add something to that, right?
That ultimately is a lot of those leadership processes I think are really important. But a lot of, and that's how we kind of have impact on our lives. Because too often we end up feeling like, oh, I'm not in charge, so I can't do anything, or I'm powerless. But there's a lot of things we can have impact on in our everyday lives in various ways. It's not suddenly everyone's going to listen, right, Frank?
Of course.
But we can have more influence than we do. And when we don't think about it or don't try, we definitely won't have influence. And so that's kind of what we try to think in the book, reflecting on your own life a little bit and how you could be a leader and engage in this leadership, even if, as we said, you're not the boss.
And so, and like you were saying earlier, Gordon, you could take some of these skills and also translate them into parenting as well.
Absolutely. That'd be a good next book side, parenting in the Marvel universe.
I need that book, Gordon. My son needs to listen to me. Please show me how.
Yeah. And Cy and I, we do this type of application all the time in our classes. And it gets down to that. Like I do a training methods class and I had someone design training for people they know. And so one person's thing was all about, how do I teach my kid to do the laundry correctly, right? And so I'm sure some people would be like, oh, that's not, your class is supposed to be about organizations and doing the laundry is not that. But training somebody in how to, use the machine in your organization and training somebody how to do the laundry there's a lot of overlap there. And that was very meaningful. Her as I think she was a stay-at-home mom while she was going to school. And so to her workforce was those kids, right?
Yeah.
And so, there's just so many applications to that. And so Cy and I have done that, for years in our classes. We've used Marvel movies, we've used various pop culture. And so this just seemed like a natural next step to kind of, do it sort of on the big level and something we can get out there where, we're talking to people in our classes, but this book can reach more people and in a fun way, help them to learn stuff.
Yeah.
And that's actually something that I think geeks do this a lot, right? And I think, Frank, this is part of the reason you have a podcast, is that you want to talk about this stuff. And what we did was we just focused the conversation around leadership and leaders in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. But, we always had, I remember as a kid having those debates, like, who's a better leader? Is it Cyclops or Storm?
Yeah.
Who do we want leading the Avengers? Is it Captain America? Is it Tony Stark? When the Civil War comics were coming out, that was a big heated debate. Like, who did you follow? Right. And I think we're just taking that and just taking what we know about the science of leadership and infusing that into the conversation.
Yeah, it's classic. It reminds me of the classic Star Trek debate, which is the best captain, which you're comparing leadership roles and seeing who does a better job in leadership roles. What started you on this path of being able to being professor in leadership? What led you into this field?
So my professor origin story is, so I've thought about this a lot. I've always loved the X-Men, and I do wonder if Professor X was part of the reason that I wanted to become a professor.
Yeah.
I think that 90s cartoon may have had a very, negative effect on me. It's just like, oh, being a professor seems cool. You get, mental powers, and you got a guy short and he's got claws and he takes people out for you. But for me, when I was in college, I thought I was going to go to medical school. So I thought I was going to be a South Asian stereotype. That didn't happen. And when that didn't happen, I ended up switching majors. I was a bio major, then it became a econ major. Graduated, had no clue what I was going to do for a career. Ended up in a job where I was doing, some work that was like human resources related, and then decided to do an MBA in HR management. And I enjoyed that stuff so much that I decided to do a PhD in something called industrial organizational psychology. And I really enjoyed it. And I was like, wow, I like this. I enjoy teaching. I love talking about this stuff. And, ended up becoming a professor at Farmingdale State College out in Long Island.
Yeah.
So it wasn't like the way that we usually think of. It wasn't like the Batman method of like, I'm going to plan to be a ninja and then, take on all the villains of Gotham City. It was more like getting bitten at some point by a psychology spider, and you're like, oh, this is cool, I like this, I'm enjoying this, and then kind of pursuing it as a dream.
Shout out to Wolverine being short, by the way. 5'3", guys. Let's make sure we cast somebody. Rep them short, please.
The only bad part of Hugh Jackman's casting is that he's too tall.
100% agree. And then everybody's casting again. They're like, oh, he's 6'2". Like, no, come on.
Wolverine don't need that 6'2".
Yeah. What about you, Gordon? Was there a spider that bit you that gave you leadership skills?
Yeah. So growing up, just was really focused on, doing well in school. And so my parents, I feel like I listened to a lot of stuff and just went along, right? And so my parents were like, you're supposed to do good in school, try to get good grades. And I was like, all right, I guess that's what I'm supposed to do, right? And so through that in high school, I got into this science research class. And so the idea is you do original research while you were in high school, which was a great opportunity. Now, I guess I was a little of an oddball because everybody else in the science research class was like, my dad is a biologist, I'm going to work in a biology lab. So in Albany, New York, there was quite a few of these scientist types in this, like biology or chemistry or physics. And so everybody else in that group was like, I'm going into these hard sciences, I'm going to be in a lab with beakers, putting stuff into various test tubes. I was like, that doesn't sound interesting at all. I think people are interesting. I'm going to do something on psychology. So I did some original research on psychology in high school, and I was like, yeah, this is pretty interesting. So then I went off to undergraduate at Cornell University, did their industrial and labor relations program, which is kind of a mix of things I was interested in, psychology and business and history. And so, I was, again, went there, get good grades, getting towards the end of that time. And I'm like, I guess I can graduate soon. Like, what the heck do I want to do? Because the goal was to do good in school, right, Frank?
Of course, and so, you did that part. Now what?
After that, you just keep doing well in school. Yeah. I guess at some point you got to leave. But if you go to graduate school, you don't have to leave. And so I think that played a little bit into me. Was one of my mentors in graduate school, Brad Bell, was an industrial organizational psychologist. And so I was like, I've never heard of this thing before, and I hadn't taken a class in it. I didn't know what it was. But it's about, workplace psychology and understanding people. And I was like, that sounds really interesting because I'm taking all these classes on work. And so that was really led me to ultimately get a master's and PhD in industrial organizational psychology. And I liked sort of that research and teaching people. And that sort of led me to go into to then get a full-time job in teaching leadership and all of that stuff. So sort of just kind of a path of like, you're a good student at some point, you got to start doing a real job. I feel like what ended up happening for me, at least.
Yeah.
The irony of these stories is that Gordon and I advise students, and we don't tell them to do this like fly by night, figure things out. We're like, really think about what you want, get some experience in an internship. We're just kind of like, oh, I decided to do PhD.
That's a big question with advising. Oh man, we're going to turn this into a weird podcast for you, Frank. But like, really, we want people to think about what to check out different stuff and look into things and figure out what they really want. Because a lot of times we ask, 18-year-olds to be like, okay, I'm going to be a biologist for 60 years, the rest of, my life or something. And that's, it's crazy. And so, some in academics are trying to do more of, okay, you should explore stuff and figure it out. And, my current job, we've got a class where you basically look at all the different things the business school offers your first year. Mm-hmm. And through that, you might have thought you really wanted to be in marketing, and then you really find you love accounting. right? And so you switch into that. And, they set it up so if you decide to switch from marketing to accounting in the first year, you're still okay.
Yeah.
And so I think those things are really useful because, yeah, it's really hard to know. And they even have that at the grad school level, right, Cy? Is you go to grad school and they're like, okay, you're going to do this huge hundreds of page dissertation. You better know what you want. And day one, you better know who you want to work with. So you're going to a school where, each of the professors are doing a very specific thing. And you're supposed to know, okay, I'm going to be doing leader member exchange the rest of my life. That's what I love. I only know it a little bit. I've done nothing yet, but I'm going to love it the rest of my life. So it's wild. Yeah, actual career paths are crazy to my mind.
Educational paths too. I know for the community college scene here in California, one of the big things that things are pushing now is that instead of going for like a 2-year then transfer immediately, now they're like, why don't you guys do it? They just started this new thing about 2 years ago where it's you get the 2-year degree and AA or AS in it so that you have something. And then from there, you could change your path if you need to. So it's like they're trying to build in flexibility, knowing, look, you're going to change your major 4 or 5 times anyways. Let's make sure that it's at least built into the system. So you
Frank, to me, it's where you're at too. So starting at 18, the research on brain development suggests that through our 20s, our brains are still changing. We're not fixed in our 20s. And so like I have a friend who I went to graduate school who, she never really liked school. And then halfway through undergraduate, she took a psychology class and suddenly she found the thing that she cared about, right? And so she went from being like a C student to being like an A student because she found that thing and she had an aptitude, but no one had ever really introduced it to her until she randomly took a psych course, right? Yeah. And that's one of the weird things. It's very hard to know what you really like or what interests you without experiencing something. And so I think those experiences are really crucial if we can get people those experiences.
Yeah. Anything you want to mention, add on to that, Si?
I was just gonna say that this also applies to leadership, right? Because sometimes people who could be really good leaders, they're like, it's too much work, right? This is too much work. I don't want to be in charge. And so if you really want to, let's say you're running an organization, you have a small business, you have a really great employee, and you think, hey, maybe they could be a manager. But they say, I don't want that responsibility. This is like a temporary gig for me. I don't want to be here that long. Then you've got to kind of figure out, well, does this person want that experience? And I think the book series that we've written it helps people think about leadership much more flexibly. And it gives everybody a way to kind of almost experience leadership vicariously through like a movie or TV show. And they can say, wow, I'm watching the Guardians of the Galaxy and each of them are a lead at a certain point in the movie, right? There, sometimes it's Rocket, sometimes it's Groot, sometimes it's Star-Lord. Maybe I could do it as a part of the team that I'm a part of. And I would love for people to be more open to those types of opportunities because looking at the way things are right now, we need better leaders, right? Across the country, across the world. Yeah. And if somebody could do it, I want them to at least think like, I think I could try it.
Yeah.
Well, and I think that's, try to digress this again back to what I was talking about before. But that's a career path thing too, because I think a lot of people are like, well, if I'm just working here for the short term, I'm not a leader, and so I don't need to develop leadership skills or get better. But you can learn skills and develop anywhere you are significantly. And so a job you're in for 2 years that isn't your future career, you could learn skills that are very, very relevant to you. But oftentimes we'll just be like, okay, this is my career and this is just something I'm doing. But something you're doing, you could also learn a lot from. I think running a podcast, for instance, coordinating different people, talking to people, learning new things.
Yeah.
All of those logistics to me, that involves a whole bunch of leadership, a whole bunch of influence, a whole bunch of very
lot of Google Calendar.
Right? There we go. We don't necessarily think about it that way, but I think it does too, to my mind.
Now, there's a term that I've always found to be very true, that this natural born leadership and somebody who's just like naturally born a leader. And when we look at, like Leaders Assemble, your guys' book, and in the MCU, do you guys see anybody who's a natural born leader? And the adverse of that, do you see anybody who's been pushed into responsibility and had to adapt to the role?
So natural born leader, I think the one character that really he doesn't change a whole lot, and I think he kind of has a lot of natural leadership capabilities. Is Captain America?
Yeah.
But I will say something interesting about his character. So when we think about leaders, there's a particular image we have in mind, and so Captain America, Steve Rogers doesn't change. Like when he's a scrawny 98-pound weakling, he's
Yeah.
still pretty much the same guy as he is when he's a 260-pound, superhero. The only difference is people's perception of whether or not he think he could be a leader. And I think that's one thing that is really interesting. He's kind of built to lead. He's built to be like a servant leader. He wants to help people, and people follow him out of respect. And so I think he has that capability. I think a lot of that has to do with like, oh, can I recognize this person as a leader? Can I see them as a leader beyond just, like the character of the person? Especially given the first movie, I think it's very hard for people to see anybody his size at that time without like physical strength to be a leader. But what's really interesting is that during the time period that Captain America is during World War II, our leader is somebody that during that time in the U.S. is somebody that we most often wouldn't think of as leaders. FDR.
Yeah.
FDR is wheelchair bound. I can't imagine how difficult it would be now for somebody who's in a wheelchair or who is visibly disabled to be perceived as a leader. That's one thing that hopefully we can change in the future.
Of course, yeah. And the FDR, I just as a side note, I think was one of our more prominent leadership leaders, you know what I'm saying, who knew fireside chats was important, making sure that there was a voice that you heard that
Yeah.
you reckon, and so many things. It's very interesting. And foreign policy, like pushing the planes across to Canada so they're picked up over there, things like that just needed to get done. How would Steve Rogers change that perception outside of getting super soldier serum? Would there be any steps he could take to like embrace that leadership role and be seen differently?
I think, Gordon, did you want to answer that one?
Guys are expert in Captain America, but I'm ready. I'm ready. I think so, and I think that's a question of finding somewhere where you can have impact. So I wouldn't suggest this as a criticism per se of Steve Rogers, but we see in the movie he just keeps trying to enroll in the military to fight it, right?
Yeah.
And so we can see that as very laudable. He wants to help. He doesn't like bullies, and it works out where he has a very big impact. So from a narrative perspective, it's great, right? And we have Captain America because he did that.
Yeah.
But there might have been somewhere else he could have had a lot of impact on the civilian side or on the non-physical side, where he could have been a great leader of relief efforts or in some other area.
Yeah.
Because in those areas they wouldn't say, oh, well, you're not big enough, you need a super soldier formula to apply for this job, right? He was as a potential inspirational leader, as a good person, as somebody with a good aptitude for leadership, he could have been really good. So maybe we have President Steve Rogers later versus popsicle Steve Rogers, for 70 years.
That's a what if comic in the making right there, President Steve Rogers.
I call us Marvel.
We've had some President Captain America type stuff. But yeah, if he's a president in 1952, I'd read it.
Me too. All right, Gordon, can you think of another superhero or another person in the MCU that was pushed into leadership and had to adapt to it?
So I actually think the Guardians of the Galaxy are a great example of some of this. So Star-Lord, to me, doesn't get, at least from what we see, a good setup to be like, oh, I'm a leader. He's got sort of this relationship with Wandu that's a little fractured, even though it's sort of father-son. Not that they see it, not that he sees it that way, right?
Right.
And so I think he becomes a leader here, but he's often been a loner doing his own thing. And so I don't think he's set up very well for being a leader, but he also doesn't have those expectations that people are going to listen or just go along, right? Because that's what we see with some leaders. They come in and expect everybody's going to listen, and they don't, or because I'm the boss. And some of the worst leaders, that's what they do, right? And so I think Star-Lord's actually really great for the Guardians because he comes into it and he knows there's going to be conflict, and he knows he doesn't see himself as just the boss. And so therefore he can deal with everybody's got their own perspective in their own direction. Certainly somebody like Rocket in the Guardians as well falls in this category. Nobody thinks the raccoon is going to be a leader of people, right? Although he is a leader of Groot, to a significant degree, has a big influence on sort of his partner there. But these are people that neither of them, I think you would say this guy or this rodent is going to be a leader. But they are good at what they do, and they both can step in when the need has.
Yeah.
So to me, both of those are people that don't show great aptitude, but whether it's hidden or whether the situation allows them to be good, I definitely think they become pretty decent leaders within the context.
And then,
Gordon, I am surprised by that answer because I had a guess as to what you were going to say, and that was not the answer that I was expecting.
Oh no.
So I thought you were going to say Ant-Man because I know you love Ant-Man. So
Well, yeah.
Because the way Paul Rudd plays that character, he does not seem like he's ever going to be a leader, but he ends up being a better leader than Hank Pym, right? Hank is smarter than him, has more money, has more resources, but Scott Lang has a team that's willing to follow him. He's able to reconcile with Hank's daughter and improve that relationship in a way that Hank himself was not able to. And so that's almost like a cautionary tale, is if you have a leader that's been in charge for a really long time, sometimes you got to move that person out and then put somebody new in who can kind of reconcile some of those issues.
Yeah, and that's a good point, because I was thinking about that too a little bit. Is a lot of times when you talk about natural born leaders, we're talking about people with all the connections and born into positions like that. So even somebody like FDR, very rich family, people that were leaders, related to Teddy Roosevelt, the former president. So if somebody is going to be prepared in their life for being a leader or has the connections, FDR is ready to go. I think he did a great job with it. And a lot of people, in that circumstance still do bad because they think, oh, I'm the boss, people will listen. But yeah, it's really interesting with Hank Pym, because he's got the expertise, he's got the experience, but he's a dick. Really, in almost every reality, Hank Pym is a dick. And I do like that the movies really leaned into that as being okay. And Mike Douglas does a great job of filling that role and Scott again is unassuming. You don't think of him as a leader, but he's leading that security crew of guys that he has. He's really have an impact, but in a mostly unassuming type way. We don't think of him as that big flashy leader. So yeah, good. Thanks for bringing that up, Si. That's true. I do love
it. It's Paul Rudd's abs that are doing most of the leading in that movie.
The guy's ageless. It's unreal. It's unfair.
Everybody's ripped in the MCU though. Yeah. Jamal Nanjiani's ripped, and then he gets to Obi-Wan and go back to normal, I guess.
And then Hank Pym's really good too, because he also shows, like Hank Pym, especially like in the comic books, shows the mental strain and the mental health issues that comes with leadership sometimes when you're in that role for too long and not managing it well. What could Hank Pym have done better so that he didn't face the issues he did face in the comic books?
That's a big question. Yeah. I'll mention a few things, and Simon can probably draw on some other stuff. But I think one of the things we don't see a lot in the comics, which I think would happen all the time with superhero teams in a real life, whatever that means, right? Is that idea of feeling jealous of others or feeling inadequate, right? And you sometimes see this in the comics when people are pushing back against superheroes or banning them. They're like, the fact there's Superman makes me feel like less of a person because he's got all this power, right?
Right.
And so I feel like Hank Pym has some of that within the Avengers just throughout the time, because we've got Thor, we've got Iron Man, for about one issue, we've got Hulk at the start, right? And so you've got these people that are very accomplished in what they do. Captain America comes back, and in theory, if you just had somebody with Hank Pym's powers versus a dude like Captain America, you'd expect that Hank Pym would grow big and crush him or have him get eaten by ants or something. So you'd assume Hank Pym would win in a fight, right? But Captain America comes in and he becomes a leader, right? He starts having a lot of impact on stuff. And so it definitely makes sense that really weighs on Hank, especially somebody who's very Hank's very male and very traditional in that way. When I would argue Hank's got to let go of, it's okay to not be the leader all the time, right? It's okay to follow and give your input when it matters. But I think kind of that pressure to be that leader. And I've seen some interesting analysis related to that as the Wasp becomes a great leader in the comics in the 80s. And Hank is really, and Hank doesn't have that same amount of influence ultimately. And so I've definitely read some of those types of things, of some of the instability, his big famous slap of his wife,
Yeah.
are all this mental instability that builds. Although I've been reading the Avengers starting at issue 1,
Oh, wow.
and Hank's got instability throughout. So there
Yeah.
definitely some problems right away. I think he needs some therapy. He needs some real self-reflection on what he's doing, and he probably needs some actual time away to like think about what's going on. He goes away in the comics some, but it's often like, oh, I'm being a scientist for a while, and then he comes back. But yeah, there's very few times when he's really at a good spot. There was a Mighty Avengers run, I think it was Dan Slott might have done, where I think he did a decent job. And ironically, that's after the Wasp died. Is after his wife dies, it almost like he can then be a little bit of a better person on it, where he doesn't feel overshadowed. Again, that's something you should talk to your marriage therapist on. That's the best Hank Pym is when his loving wife is gone. But for him, there is definitely that pressure thing. I feel like he's somebody who would have been good, going to the Defenders or some other team where he was not just, the fifth best choice to be leader, and fifth best might be, overstating the case. Some smaller team, he might have been good on it, although his leadership skills might just be lacking in his perspective. So I don't know.
I do remember him on West Coast Avengers. He was not a leader really on West Coast Avengers. This was after like he got into trouble, and there's that joke now that like the things that men will do to avoid therapy. I guess Hank Pym will shrink himself rather than go to therapy. But I do think the one thing that would have helped Hank a lot is if he had found a mentor, or somebody to talk to. He really needed to humble himself a little bit to kind of take mentorship from another person. This is something we talk about in the book, is that that having somebody in that mentorship role that can kind of guide you, can kind of help you, can kind of check you a little bit and kind of say like, hey, it seems like you're having some real problems. You need to go to therapy, or you need to go develop some of your leadership skills, your communication skills, your delegation skills. And I think that has a huge impact. In the movies, we see the impact that Tony Stark's mentorship has on Spider-Man.
Yeah.
Right. He's a very different character by the end of his experience with Tony than at the beginning. And you really get to see that impact that you can have on a high school kid just by being there, being available, especially for somebody like Peter, who doesn't have like a father figure in his life anymore. That really has a huge impact. And even when you're working somewhere, having somebody that you can bounce ideas off of, being that person can be very valuable. And we know from a lot of research that mentors get as much out of that mentoring relationship as mentees. I think Tony gains a lot from that experience with Spider-Man by being his mentor. I think that kind of prepares him for fatherhood later on in the MCU, where you see that he can actually have a kid and be a parent. That is a big change, because in Iron Man 1, that guy is not taking care of any kids.
No. Yeah, we actually, it's funny when you look at the Iron Man path, especially in MCU, and you relate it to Hank Pym. There's just a couple steps that could have gone either way, and we could have seen Tony Stark down the same path where he takes too much on himself and he ends up going off the rails a little bit and becomes Yellow Jacket. You talk about different versions of leadership. We have shared leadership, servant leadership, authentic leadership. Can you explain a little bit of what those are, and maybe some examples we could pull from the MCU?
Sure. I guess I'll start with servant leadership, because I kind of mentioned this one before, but Captain America is a great example of servant leadership. In Captain America First Avenger, you see that he's the first one to jump on that grenade, and that's what a good servant leader does. Is a servant leader sees themselves as being the one to clear the path for their followers, so that they can kind of make it through and get the work done. And that's part of the reason I think servant leadership is so powerful and so popular, is that it really changes the role of a leader from being somebody that I command you to go do this for me, and it's more like, well, what can I do to help you to accomplish this? All right, Gordon, which one would you like to tackle next?
I can do authentic leadership. So authentic leadership, we talk about in the book, related to Iron Man, to Tony Stark. Authentic leadership to some degree is acting truthfully and open and honest with your team with the people that you work with. And so it is essentially about being yourself, right? And a lot of times in leadership, we have kind of this fronting, right? Is the leader's perfect, the leader doesn't make mistakes, the leader is the best at everything. And we see that all the time with a lot of the CEOs and others that we, sometimes get worshipped so much out there in the world. Some might laugh because I mention him all the time here, but like Steve Jobs, right?
Right.
We act like Steve Jobs is the greatest programmer of all time, the greatest leader of all time, and Apple made a huge mistake when they fired him that one time. Well, at the time they were trying to scale up and he was a very bad businessman and wouldn't let go. They should have fired him then. Apple would be out of business now if they had kept him at the time.
Yeah.
And he is not the best programmer at Apple by a wide margin. Steve Wozniak is genius, right? And a bunch of other people too. Wozniak's one of the few we actually know because he's genius and we've learned enough. But Steve Jobs was not the best at that. He was good at vision stuff, especially later on. He was able to project sort of a vision to the public and people very well that was appealing. Those are to be lauded, but we often talk about Steve Jobs as if we should all be programmers like Steve Jobs. Nope. We should be ethical like Steve Jobs. No, he stole work from Wozniak, did a bunch of crap. It's kind of, and so I think that that's one of the things that can come up all the time is that we don't have leaders that are authentic. I think that's one thing with Tony Stark that I really like is, he is inherently kind of a jerk and kind of selfish. And we might think for him to be a good leader, he needs to be a saint and give up all of his earthly desires, right? But that's not him being authentic to himself. And I think that's one of the interesting arcs we see in the Iron Man movies, and we talk about it in the chapter, is various times Tony talks about, quitting being Iron Man, and he blows up all his armors in Iron Man 3, and then I guess rebuilds them 5 minutes later for the next movie because the Avengers have to go on, right? But basically he keeps trying to be like, I've got to be good in a conventional sense. I need to be, the guy doing philanthropy, or we don't sell weapons anymore. I need to be on the sidelines. I need to retire as the hero. But that's not who Tony is. Tony is a wise ass. He's somebody who wants to be out there on the front line doing the super heroics. And he can't be his best leader when he's pretending to be somebody else. And so I think that his path across the movies shows him trying to get more in touch with that, of being who he is, as well as being a good leader, as opposed to trying to be a perfect leader or trying to be something else. Because where he starts at Iron Man 1 is he, in theory, he's bragging about dating supermodels and being rich and everybody loves him, but he is miserable. He's miserable. He hates his life. And it takes the kidnapping and all that for him to realize, I need to change. And we talk about in the chapter, the self-awareness. He becomes aware that he cares about the world. He wants to have a positive impact. He does want to lead others, but it isn't suddenly the light switch flips and suddenly he's perfect. It takes time for him to develop. It takes experience. And his arc couldn't have happened without that. You couldn't have went from Iron Man 1 to Avengers Endgame, right? He really needed to struggle and move back and forth and make mistakes, because that's really what life is. It's not just progression from nothing to perfection, right? It's improving and getting better and finding out, oh, we're doing this wrong, or we could get better. That's at least my view. And so that's kind of what authentic leadership is. People feel, I feel like I understand Frank and what he does and what he's about. Is he perfect? No, but I can trust him. And I know he's gonna do his best and that. And that's kind of how we talk about it within the chapter, is that. So that's the authentic leadership part.
For authentic leadership, in comparison, especially to something like servant leadership, do you think authentic leadership learns to delegate and work with others more so than, say, like you're saying with Steve Jobs, who's almost like put up on a pedestal? Do you think the authentic leaders learn that, look, I need others to better myself? Like Tony Stark in the first movie, nobody else around him, but over time learn that, like, look, I don't like Steve Rogers sometimes, but I need him to check me.
Yeah. I think there is that level of being checked and being authentic and being aware you need skills or development, because that's one of the big things we'll see with leaders all the time is they're good at a lot of things, but they're bad at something and they don't know. So I would say someone like Mark Zuckerberg, I wouldn't put him in front of a microphone ever.
Yeah.
He doesn't project well at all. I think the same thing when Michael Eisner was in charge of Disney. He wanted to be Walt Disney out there in front of the camera. He was not charismatic. Maybe he's gotten better now and he's charismatic. I haven't seen him recently very often, but he was doing, the Disney Presents, and you're just like, this guy's awkward. He shouldn't be doing that. Again, nothing wrong with somebody else being your spokesperson or doing that. If Steve Jobs is the one who can go out there and project for your business what it's doing, great. That's the dude who should be doing it. Your best programmer doesn't need to be your best public speaker. And so I think that definitely comes up quite a bit. I think servant leaders, and Sai, you can jump in a minute here, they can delegate and they can help, but there can be the downside sometimes as servant is you can feel like I've got to do everything or I have to sacrifice. And that can be bad because sometimes it's not the best for everyone, even though you're sacrificing.
Yeah, absolutely. With servant leaders especially, they tend to take on a lot of the work, and good leaders actually delegate more of the work. They're not supposed to be the ones doing most of the stuff. And I think we've all had managers that did a lot of the work, and we really liked them, but they were doing too much, and so they weren't able to coordinate. And so one thing we see across a lot of leadership theories is you could kind of put leadership behaviors into two broad buckets. The first is keeping your group, your team, whoever you're leading, task focused. So if you're a leader and you don't push anybody to actually accomplish the work, that's bad leadership, right? You're not getting what needs to be done. The other side of it is if you just push all the time and you're not caring, you don't show any care for the relationships that you have with people, nobody's going to want to keep working with you. So the second bucket is that relationship stuff. So leaders have to stay focused on the task. They have to make sure that they're able to, if they need to get resources or help their teams accomplish work, they need to be able to do that. But then they also have to maintain a healthy work environment, keep good norms. They don't want to be rewarding people just because, oh, I'm your friend, even though you did something wrong, I'm going to protect you, which we see oftentimes in many organizations. We see that all the time. So, good leaders are able to balance those things. And you can see that each, leader in the MCU, they're sometimes better at certain things than others. So if you needed a task done, like if you needed a new system built, Tony's your guy. He might rub everybody the wrong way. He may not be as good at the relationship stuff, but he'll get that task done and he'll have his team complete that. Whereas somebody like, Steve Rogers, he may not have that technical capability. He might be able to, kind of bring everybody together and say, hey, what do you need? Let me help you. And then you guys can finish this work.
Yeah. And then can you guys discuss the shared leadership as well?
Sure, I can talk a little bit about shared leadership. So we talked a little bit about the Guardians of the Galaxy being the Guardians of the Galaxy being a team of shared leaders. Like if you watch the Guardians movie, they're really individuals, and they're individuals that are joining together. They're forming a group, they're forming a team, but they can do pretty much everything on their own for the most part, right? But each of them takes the leadership role at different points in time. So for example, during the prison break, Rocket is our leader, right? He's the one who sets the agenda. He's the one who says, here's what the plan is. Here's what we're going to do. Near the end, before the big battle, Star-Lord is the one that says, hey, everybody, we need to get together. We need to do this. We need to figure this out. And at different times in different parts of these movies, different characters are leaders, right? And at the very end, the character that you think, oh, he's not going to lead anybody, but right at the very end, you see that Groot kind of brings everybody together. He heals those relationships and he helps them refocus on the task at hand by saying that, oh, we are Groot, right? He sets that mission for everybody to get them through that last part of the first Guardians movie. And it's weird to think about Groot leading anybody because he literally only says one word, but sometimes the actions of a leader and the care that that followers have for a leader can be that force. One thing that we see in the leadership literature, especially when it comes to teams, is that if you have a group of people working together, they understand the mission, they're committed to one another, they're committed to the organization, they can actually work independently. We see that a lot in tech companies where there are very clear roles, there are very clear things that people are going to do. And, leader kind of says, hey, here's your assignment, here's what you're going to do. You can come to me if you need support. But otherwise, you're kind of independent. I always feel like the Guardians of the Galaxy are sort of like that. They're in the same space, they're working in the same area, they're going on missions together, but they're really independent and they kind of come together and switch off roles very easily.
Yeah.
I was going to say as well, just to add to a little bit, I think the Avengers can do that. It doesn't come up as much in the MCU because you've got kind of these big events. But in the comic, a lot of the best comics, every member has some type of value for the situation, right? And so a lot of times they will lead in a situation. So somebody like Black Widow as a team member will step up when we're talking about espionage or delicate work, Thor related to Asgard, those types of things. I think the old joke always with cartoons and like the Justice League was you'd always have something happen in the water. So Aquaman would have something to do,
Yeah.
right? And that's like a joke, but that is often going to be true on teams. We have situations where this person is the most knowledgeable, the most skilled, the one who can really direct our work in particular ways. We see it sometimes cross-culturally. So if we're going to be doing business with Japan, well, we've got one guy who's the expert on how that works and how we should negotiate or what we should do. And so in that situation, that person should be in charge. That's shared leadership. And people feel okay, I'm taking a second seat here or a third seat because somebody else is best for this situation, this context.
In the MCU, do you see a story developing or a story you want to explore more where somebody's taking a leadership role and you think that you should really spotlight it?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the big things we saw when putting the book together, we've got a chapter on women in leadership within the MCU. And so it got us to think a lot more about Black Widow and specifically the 5-year gap period. So the movies cover that, pretty vaguely, right? It's sort of like, well, the hero's lost, half the population is gone, the world sucks, and then we're kind of like mostly like 5 years later.
Yeah.
And so we only get kind of a hint of what happens. But what happens, it seems, is that Black Widow kind of steps up and is the leader and sort of takes over this whole thing. It definitely speaks to some of the sexism and prejudices that we have in society, is that Black Widow seems to get her opportunity because Tony Stark leaves, Hulk leaves, Thor goes off, Cap looks like he's helping people deal with grief, but not really doing the leadership part of the Avengers. And so what we see in Endgame early is Black Widow's kind of running the Avengers and sort of the world of superheroes, interacting with others in the world about what's going on. And so she's a very important job and she's been doing it for a while, right? And so it's a period of time I'd be really interested in us covering more, because unlike some movies, when we take a look at these big catastrophic events, the world seems to be doing pretty good considering this happens. Half the population dies and the world seems to be functioning kind of normally 5 years later, right?
Yeah.
We got war memorials and stuff like that. People are sad. We're still dealing with things, but the world is functioning a lot better than I would have expected, in that situation. And I would say Black Widow and others, Captain Marvel and War Machine, okay, all these people have had a great impact and probably went through a lot of things to make the world better in this very bad situation. And so I think Black Widow probably is a very good leader and had a lot of good impact, but we haven't covered it in these movies really at all, right?
Yeah.
And that, of course, is something that I think is kind of tragic is, Scott Lang comes back and says, we got a solution. And then suddenly all the old white dudes that were in charge, Cap and then Tony,
Yeah.
the whole come back and say, all right, a man's going to take over again, right? And so she goes back to just being another member of the team, when I would argue she's got 5 years of experience in the most stressful and the biggest crisis the world has ever known. She probably has a lot more to add to the situation. And so it's a bit of a shame that she didn't do that. And there's actually research that talks about this a little bit, is there's this idea of the glass cliff. And so you might have heard of the glass ceiling for women and minorities. They can't get above a certain level. But there's an interesting other idea, which is the idea of the glass cliff, which suggests that women tend to be promoted in situations when there's been a big scandal or when the company is doing badly, those types of situations. So basically women get the keys to the keys to the kingdom when you're in the worst possible situation, when you're most likely to fail. And then,
when
of course,
there's
when
like PR that like benefits
leader,
from it too. You always see that. I can't stand that. We see it a lot right now with video game companies. Sorry to cut you off, Gordon, but we see it a lot with video game companies where it's like, oh, sexual harassment scandal. Quickly promote a woman so that we can say, look, we're not sexual harassers. We have a woman as leading, and it's like, damn it, guys.
The situation is so sad with that too, because the female leader wasn't on her own, was paired with somebody, and then left much earlier. Right? That is a great illustration of how it goes. Right? Yeah. And so to some degree, I feel like Black Widow did a great job in a very glass ceiling situation. You don't want to be in charge when half the population has disappeared, and most of the major heroes are like, I'm quitting due to PTSD. I need a break.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's definitely a pretty good example of that glass cliff. And so in really watching the movies again, that came out a lot more. When narratively, I think they mostly kind of pass it over. We don't really think of that 5 years as a big thing. I would love to see more of that. I think Falcon and the Winter Soldier goes into a little bit of some of the people affected, but I would love to have more stuff right in that period of what's going on, because I think it'd be really interesting to see, how do we deal with this big thing? It's a different situation than, punch really hard to beat the bad guy.
It's not really a Hulk situation. And Falcon and the Winter Soldier did address one situation where they said, a lot of the people that were displaced, like sadly in our normal lives, refugees and whatnot, found new homes. They felt people needed to work. So that shift think of how big of a shift that would be in society. And here you had Black Widow Natasha running the show during this, and just shows like the humanitarian efforts that were going in place, which is something that Avengers also does outside of just fighting Thanos. There's all the humanitarian stuff, and that was all in place there too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, sure.
What about you, Sai? Is there any particular story of leadership you want to see spotlighted?
I would love to see more Captain Marvel stuff during the blip, especially because Ms. Marvel's coming out, and one of the things that I've been hearing a lot is people are kind of saying like, well, why does Kamala Khan like Captain Marvel so much? Captain Marvel is also one of those characters that's left during the blip, and she's kind of handling a lot of the cosmic stuff. She's got, she may not be as prominent a leader as Natasha during this time, but I'd love to see what she's doing. I would love to see a Black Widow 2 where it's, Natasha and Carol Danvers kind of working together on something, just to get the most bang for your buck out of a film. I think it'd be really interesting to see. And it would be really interesting to see a human character interacting almost as a representative of Earth with all of these characters from Guardians and with all the aliens and things like that. That would be really a cool, thing to see in terms of negotiation. What do you do when you're negotiating from a position maybe not of the most strength, right? Like Earth generally doesn't have as much technology, doesn't have as much power as some of these other places. What does somebody like Captain Marvel do in that situation? Even though she herself is arguably the most powerful character in the MCU, right?
Yeah.
So that would be a really super interesting thing to see. And also just to see, two female leaders together would be a lot of fun. My hope is like when we eventually get X-Men, that we get Storm as the leader of the X-Men pretty quickly.
Yes, please.
Well, and I think that's an interesting, like I've seen talk online of like, oh, Miss Marvel is replacing Captain Marvel, and this sort of, there's only one or the other. And we see this all the time with female leaders or minority leaders as well. We've got one that's enough. And so it's a big universe with people working together, and they fill very different roles. And so I think a blip series would be a great series to show that female 100%. Leadership.
I never thought about it, but now that's all I'm thinking about is how you could just do one, just put Danvers going from each planet to planet. First off, explaining what happened, because nobody else knows about Thanos and all these other planets. So we're like, hey, by the way, half your people are gone because of this one jerk, this purple dude. And then also just being like, what's the most pressing issue? I have other planets to visit. what do we need to fix right now? And so she tries her best. I mean, that's a series right there for sure.
It's so Earth-centric, right? You're like, half the population of the whole universe
Yeah.
disappeared, but only Earth got the televised
This backwater planet that doesn't have anything the Nova Corps has. Yeah, we're the center of everything right now. One thing I really like about this book, and I want to make sure that everybody understands, is you learn so much about leadership. And again, that's part of everyday life beyond just in my workplace or anything like that. There's all kinds of leadership, parenting, and just even in your friend circle. When you try to figure out who's going to go to where we're going to go to eat for dinner, guys, it's the leader that's going to say, look, let's just go to Sizzlers. But you're also going to be able to rewatch the MCU movies and appreciate them in a new way. So I want to make sure you guys check this out. It's called Leaders Assemble: Leadership in the MCU. You can grab it on Amazon, and I'm sure in many bookstores. Any place in particular that you guys should be going to pick up this book? Anything in particular?
I think Amazon's a great place to get
Amazon?
it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Amazon's the spot. That's the probably most common place. I believe Barnes and Noble also has it on their website.
Okay.
So definitely
Walmart
any
does
place
as well.
we can get books.
Walmart has books.
Walmart. There we go.
Yes.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if it was on Barnes and Noble. I know that sometimes they don't have some and stuff like that. So that's what I wasn't sure about.
Yeah, I think it's on most places online.
Okay. If you're in the local area, my local area, Capital City Books, go support the local guys. We always appreciate that. Okay, so where can they follow you guys? Your Twitter accounts, your Instagrams. Let's start with you, Gordon. Where can people follow you?
Yeah, so I've got a Twitter account. It's at IO Psychology. And if you want it for the show notes, I can certainly get you that too. I'm on LinkedIn as well. If you just look up Gordon Schmidt, you probably can find my face there too. Yeah, we do LinkedIn more, Frank, of course, because we're professors.
Professors,
so probably Twitter's best.
Okay.
Yeah, I've been talking about comics quite a bit on Twitter lately too. So we got some fun comic discussion too.
Yeah. I know you threw out some Star Trek questions today too. I was like, oh, that's a good one.
Star Trek. Because I was watching Next Generation to start, and it's fascinating. They're like, well, you can't be married and be a captain. That's just not the life. And so it's really weird. It's really wild stuff when you look at some of that now. They talk, obviously you talk about all the sci-fi is really about the era it's actually in. Yeah. And so that stuff, it's like, it's whatever number of years in the future, but it's really 1987.
Yeah. Well, even like with the 60s version with the original series, there's a through line plot of, well, Kirk can never really love a woman because he loves his ship instead. Oh. And so there's like, okay, what does that mean? And can he develop as a human without, be on the ship? So,
yeah, it's really interesting. Yeah, I'm curious. We love Star Trek too as well, and we're such big fans of it over time. So
yeah, classic.
Gordon, are you sure that they're not allowed to be married and captain the ship?
But there's a whole.
Are these Jedi rules? Like, well, what is this?
So Riker and Troy have a discussion when there's an episode. Season one is a dumpster fire of Next Generation.
It is for each one,
but they also were trying to figure stuff out. So I feel for them, but I don't know how I could recommend the series to someone. I'm like, well, you'll watch 20 hours that are really bad mostly.
Yeah.
Actually, my favorite from season one is actually Tasha Yar, which is really interesting because they make her feel kind of human. Mm-hmm. Like everyone else is we don't have emotions as much. It's a weird. But so Troy and Riker have a discussion where they're like, oh, we're still kind of in love, but you want to be a captain. So obviously you couldn't get married because your career is so important. So Frank, kind of what you're saying with Captain Kirk. And I feel that way with Picard too. It's like, well, you can't have romantic entanglements because you're a captain, which is interesting because Next Generation in theory is about, we've got a ship with families on
it. Yeah. It's like the opening line to the whole series.
You so rarely see anyone, other kids. It's like, it's fascinating to me. The sort of the whole underlying stuff there. That's the thing, like Sinai's professors too, we're nerdy with really the weird details of stuff I get into where I'm watching something. I was like, I wonder how this works here. And I'd sent a question about pets in Star Trek is like, did everyone stop with pets mostly? Data's got a cat, I think, or something.
Data's got a cat. Janeway has a dog she left at home, and it's like the thing she misses the most. And so it's the whole time it's like, well, do you make a holodeck version of your dog so you can go pet him for a while? What do you do?
I thought that was Janeway though. You're going on a 5-year mission and your pet's at home. There would be pets on any Star Trek. There'd be so many pets. Like if you look at the modern day, something would have to happen in our history where we stop having pets for that there not to be like there's dog poop all over the Enterprise. Would be
That's such a sad idea.
yeah.
Like, yeah, during World War III, were pets targeted? Like, something happened to the pet population.
We should have virtual. Tamagotchi's, version 37.5, or there should be pets 100%.
Mental health alone on a 5-year mission. Pets are important. Yeah, keep people.
Yeah, don't get married. Don't have a pet. Just hang out and. The
you
holiday
are your
is
job.
a lot different if everybody's single. They don't even have a pet. They got nothing to do.
There we go.
Yeah.
My God. Yeah, you'd literally be your job. Like that is like season 1 is a lot of that. It's like, does Geordi love the engine? Maybe. Who knows?
We're gonna leave him alone with the warp core. Sai, where can people follow you, man?
So usually Twitter. So I am IOSY Islam. So IOSY Islam. That's the place to find me. I'm also on LinkedIn. If you look up Sai Islam, you can find me there. I don't really use Instagram for any professional purpose. So, my IG would not be interesting to anybody. It's not even interesting to me most times, but, definitely Twitter. Twitter's where I have the most fun. I know most people think Twitter's very bad. I have a lot of fun on it. I think
you could tailor it to be good. Yeah,
you can. Yeah, you could. You put good stuff out there, and good stuff will come back. So that's always been the fun part.
Yeah. All right, guys. It's called Leaders Assemble: Leadership in the MCU. Check it out. We'll have links to it and their socials in the description. Thank you guys very much for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks
for having us.
All right, guys. We'll see you guys next week with another interview. Bye. All right, don't leave. Got the kids and all the recordings.